Hi, I'm in 35 gang. Well, I got kicked out of the gang. And it's 28 for me now, baby. In this video, I wanted to give you a quick hit guide on why you might decide to go with one of these lenses over the other. The biggest differences in my mind are astro, macro, stabilization, and field of view. I'll walk through these big four, and there are others, but for the purposes of this video, let's consider some of those smaller differences equal and treat them as such. For instance, the RF 28mm is currently $299, and the RF 35mm macro is $499. That's a considerable difference compared to each other, but they're both squarely in the same class as compared to the RF 15 to 35 and the RF 28 to 70 zooms and the L prime versions if they ever get released. The 35mm macro has a wider maximum aperture at f1.8 compared to f2.8, and that's not insignificant as it's more than one full stop. This isn't a big issue for astro, however, and I'll touch more on the difference in max aperture at the end of the video, but both lenses are generally plenty suitable in low light. The 28mm Pancake has changed our perception of how small we can physically go on the RF bodies, but the 35mm isn't large or heavy either. We can agree that they are both small and they both balance well on lighter bodies like the R8. Neither are weather sealed, and neither are particularly friendly with some of the classic 77mm and 82mm filters you have laying around. And we've got STM motors in each as well. Now, on to the key differences. Since my Pancake review came out, I snuck in some legitimate Milky Way shots in September. I'm no expert, and hopefully this goes without saying, but don't let having the 35mm macro prevent you from going out and shooting astro. If you haven't tried it yet, taking an astro trip makes it fun and rewarding to chase clear dark skies and try to make your first very own Milky Way edit. You know, that said, the 28mm Pancake is the winner here in terms of star quality along the edges of your frame. There doesn't appear to be much, if any, coma aberration where the stars start having these little wings. This is very noticeable when comparing both wide open, as the 35mm suffers at f1.8. And based on what I've seen others try, the 28mm is still better when comparing both of these lenses at f2.8, when the RF 35mm macro is stopped down. With the 28mm, you can also keep your shutter open a few seconds longer than the RF 35mm macro. If I want to clean up some noise, I use Starry Landscape Stacker on Mac OS and stack several images. Obviously, that technique works with any images, either lens. I'd encourage you to try either at night, but I prefer the framing of the 28mm for the Milky Way, at least compared to the other things that I've tried, like this 35mm, or in the past, the ultra-wide 14mm. And that's one of the reasons I pulled the trigger on the Sigma EF 28mm late last year. The macro capabilities aren't a contest. You can guess that from the naming of the 35mm macro. The win here goes hands down to the 35mm macro, given the minimum focusing distance and maximum magnification. What's important to know is that the closest focusing of the 35mm is just under 7 inches, with a max magnification of 0.5x. A 1:2 macro. For the 28mm, it's 9 inches and 0.17x. Huge difference, and if you think you want to do any work close up, it's probably worth giving the 35mm a look. Lens image stabilization is also an option when you reach for the 35mm macro, and given the size, it's understandably absent on the 28mm Pancake. So another win here if you take handheld video of any kind, or have one of Canon's bodies that doesn't sport IBIS, and you prefer not to mess with digital IS. For me, this isn't my biggest consideration, but it might be for you. The 28mm on the Canon R8 without digital IS enabled is shaky as you'd expect, and if this is your main use case, maybe steer clear. But I just don't typically use these lenses too heavily in this fashion. In the past, when I was using the RF35 more often, it was one of the best options at the time to complement the RF 24 to 105, at least on the wider end. So while the lens IS isn't a massive draw for me either way, I'll still greedily take the option. Finally, on focal length, we have a draw, as this will be heavily based on scenario and personal preference. But I'll tell you why I've drifted toward the 28 over the past year. For photography, I don't currently have a wide zoom, and I'm not sure if and when I'll end up with one, at least a fast wide zoom. I do have the 24 to 35 range on the 24 to 105, but that's f4. And the 28mm for landscape shooting is a good middle ground for me between 24 and 35. There are certainly times that I do want wider, but I've felt really comfortable with the 28 so far. It's a bit easier to compose sometimes than 24, and I can always punch in and crop if needed to approximate something that looks like a 35mm frame. I do prefer the 35 for video work. I like the tighter look when I need an A-roll shot when seated at my traditional desk, but the 28 works almost just as well, and sometimes better if I'm filming larger items on the desk, or if I want to use it for a top-down camera. At this point in the life of the channel, between this 35, this 28, and the Sigma 28, these are the two focal lengths that I've used most for this A-roll shot here. I think the calculus changes a little bit if you have an APS-C body. The full frame field of view equivalents for these lenses will be 45mm and 56mm for the 28 and 35 respectively. So you'll be in a more normal middle range, and it doesn't quite feel like the same high stakes pick between wider landscape work and closer portraiture, because that's what I feel like the choices between when you're shooting on a full frame sensor. If I had an APS-C body, I would probably go with the 28 just based on size and cost alone. And finally, coming back to the difference in maximum aperture in these two lenses, this is going to matter most if you're doing a lot of portrait work. Otherwise, you've got great cameras that handle noise well, you've got AI tools, you've got things like Lightroom's early access lens blur. For portraits though, all other variables similar. 35mm at f1.8 will better separate your subject from your background than the 28 will at f2.8. If you shoot weddings, events, or portraiture elsewhere, the 35 just gives you more options in terms of capturing light and controlling the look of your background. I prefer breaking out the 50mm and really 85 for portraits, so it doesn't bother me often that the 35mm has an edge here, but it is a smart thing to consider. Watch me pour some syrup on this 28mm lens in this video, or listen to me rant about why the faster Sigma 28 has been a great compromise to a zoom for me over the last year.